Daniel Mercer had never believed in fate, but something about that afternoon felt different. The garage was hot and stale, filled with boxes, stacked like forgotten tombstones, each one labeled in faded marker, or not labeled at all. The place had been untouched since his uncle's passing 2 months ago, and no one in the family wanted to deal with it. But Daniel volunteered, maybe out of guilt, maybe curiosity, or maybe a whisper in the back of his mind that something was waiting for him. There he moved box after box, finding old tools, rusted fishing gear, torn uniforms, dusty photographs of his uncle in uniform, with nameless men standing in front of planes and radar trucks from another era. But then, in the far corner behind a broken workbench and 2 flat tires, he spotted a dark green metal box, its hinges corroded and its top covered in what looked like layers of paint and dust, as if someone had gone out of their way to hide it from view. There was no lock, but the lid groaned like something exhaling after a long sleep. When he lifted it inside, he found 5 film reels carefully wrapped in cloth and stacked side by side, each reel marked with a red wax pencil, Project Echo 47, Reel 1, Reel 2, and so on. Under the reels was a smaller container holding a logbook full of notes in his uncle's handwriting, dates, coordinates, weather conditions, odd codes, and once even the phrase, "no visible propulsion." Daniel sat on the cold floor of the garage, flipping through the logbook, noticing that most entries were made between 1981 and 1983. He recognized some of the coordinates from his work in GIS mapping and cross-checked them on his phone. Each one pointed to restricted airspace in Nevada, near a place he'd heard mentioned in whispers and conspiracy documentaries. Groom Lake. He was sweating now, not just from the heat but from the weight of what he was holding. In his hands the box felt like a relic, like something sacred and forbidden. The film reels themselves were heavy and cold to the touch, with labels so faded he had to tilt them toward the light just to read the numbers. His heart pounded as he realized that these reels might contain footage that was never supposed to be seen. Again, he didn't tell anyone, not his mother, not his girlfriend, not even his closest friend from college. Instead, he drove into town the next day and found a vintage electronics store run by an old man who didn't ask too many questions and just smiled when Daniel asked if he had a working 16mm projector back in his basement. Later that night, Daniel threaded the film carefully through the machine. The bulb flickered to life, casting shadows on the walls, and as the first reel began to turn, he saw what looked like a wide desert landscape, bare and silent. But then a white orb appeared in the sky, moving smoothly, unnaturally, cutting across the horizon at impossible speed. No wings, no exhaust, just motion. He leaned forward, eyes wide, mouth dry, as more orbs appeared, some flickering, some pulsing. The footage was shaky but clear enough to show what could not be explained, and Daniel realized in that moment he had uncovered something no one was ever meant to find. The room was silent except for the soft mechanical whir of the projector spinning behind him, casting light and flickering shadows across the concrete walls of the basement. Daniel sat still, barely breathing, his eyes locked on the screen in front of him as the orb danced across the sky with smooth, deliberate motion. It made no sound, had no wings, no visible propulsion, and yet it moved with a purpose, almost like it was scanning something or following a path invisible to human eyes. The reel continued, showing wide shots of desert landscapes, sometimes with radio towers in the background, or broken silhouettes of aircraft wreckage, and then the orb would appear again, always from different angles, sometimes moving straight up into the clouds, vanishing in a blink. Other times it hovered for several seconds, as if aware of the camera, before shooting off in a direction no jet could match. Daniel watched reel after reel, each more puzzling than the last. Some frames showed multiple objects, 2 or 3 orbs circling each other in a slow spiral before merging into a single light and disappearing. Here paused the projector, rewound the footage, and watched it again and again, each time catching something new, a flicker of light just outside the frame, a sudden dip in brightness, as if the camera had briefly lost power, a flash of static that seemed to coincide with the object's closest approach. Whatever this was, it was interfering with the equipment and leaving traces behind, subtle but undeniable. He opened the logbook again, this time matching the footage to the handwritten notes his uncle had scrawled across the pages. May 9, 1982. 300 hours, location BR73, object observed west to east, no sonic boom, visual only, no radar, contact. Then, another June 14, 1982, 3 lights seen over test range, holding pattern, observed 41 seconds, confirmed by 3 witnesses, same result in thermal and optical camera. Blackouts during closest pass, Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. These weren't just home videos. This was data carefully recorded and possibly stolen from a classified project. For a moment he sat in the dark, his mind racing with questions. Why had his uncle kept this? What was Project Echo 47? And how had this information never been leaked or discovered before? He searched online, but found nothing credible, just dead ends, conspiracy forums, and vague mentions of old Cold War programs. Some speculated Echo referred to radar jamming experiments. Others thought it was a code name for early drone testing, but nothing matched what he was seeing with his own eyes. He considered calling someone a journalist, maybe even a UFO researcher, but hesitated, unsure of who to trust and whether he could risk exposing himself. Yet something inside him told him this could not stay hidden forever. People needed to see this. It was too real, too consistent, too strange to be dismissed as a weather balloon or a misidentified plane. As he loaded the last reel onto the projector, Daniel felt something shift in the air, a heaviness like the room itself understood the importance of what was unfolding. The footage clicked on, and this time there were voices faint in the background. Radio chatter, someone saying it's back again, maintain visual, no radio signal, then silence, and the white orb appearing once more, hovering motionless, as if watching, waiting before disappearing straight into the clouds. Daniel leaned back, staring into the fading light, knowing in his gut that this was just the beginning. The next morning Daniel woke up early, unable to shake the images from his mind. The glowing orbs, the unnatural movements, the eerie silence, they followed him into the daylight, haunting his every thought. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the logbook, trying to make sense of the codes and notations scattered across the yellowed pages. He flipped to the front, where his uncle had written his name, rank, and a small phrase in block letters. Echo 47, do not share. Daniel knew now this was never meant for anyone else to see, and that realization made the weight of what he had discovered all the more terrifying. He decided to dig deeper into his uncle's past, not the stories his family told about fishing trips and quiet holidays, but the path that was always glossed over, the years spent stationed in Nevada at a classified test range known only by vague references in old letters and military forms. He searched through family photo albums until he found one that made his breath catch. It was a black and white image, his uncle in uniform standing next to a radar truck behind him, a tall chain-link fence, and a large sign, partially visible, reading warning, military installation, no unauthorized entry. The date on the back read, August 1981. Daniel scanned it into his laptop and ran a reverse image search, hoping it would match with some archive or base record. Instead, he was directed to a declassified map of military installations from the early 80s, and there it was, marked in faint ink just outside of Groom Lake, a small dot labeled Echo Site BR73. The same code repeated again and again. In the logbook he looked back through the notes, this time reading them aloud, trying to piece together the story his uncle had never told. High-altitude activity above Echo Site, continued anomalies in visual range, white sphere observed, northeast quadrant, thermal interference recorded, radar unable to lock. He needed answers, and decided to take a risk. He reached out to an old military historian he had met once at a university lecture, a man named Dr. Ian Kellerman, who specialized in Cold War surveillance programs. Daniel sent him a cryptic email asking if he had ever heard of Echo 47, and within hours he received a reply, a single line, saying, "Meet me in person, no phones, no recordings, only truth." 2 days later, Daniel met him at a coffee shop far from town. Dr. Kellerman was older, thinner than he remembered, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. He listened as Daniel described what he had found, and then nodded slowly, saying, Echo 47 was real. It was a covert tracking program designed to monitor unidentified aerial phenomena. During the height of Cold War paranoia, the public believed we feared Russian weapons, but behind closed doors, the brass was more concerned with the things we couldn't explain, things that didn't behave like anything we knew. When Daniel showed him a still frame from the footage, the doctor grew pale and said he had seen a similar object once during a joint military observation in 1983. It had moved like liquid light and disappeared into thin air after disrupting every instrument they had on site. He looked Daniel in the eyes and said, "Your uncle risked everything to keep this, and you might be risking even more to share it. But some truths bury themselves and others find a way out, no matter who tries to stop them." Daniel left the meeting knowing now that he was standing at the edge of something vast, hidden, and possibly dangerous. Daniel spent the following week submerged in research, mapping coordinates, matching dates, and building a timeline that stretched across 2 years of logged encounters. Everything pointed back to the same region, the same base, the same restricted skies. Each event occurred at night, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always under perfect weather conditions, and always without radar confirmation. He began to notice a pattern not only in the flight paths but in the behavior of the objects. They would enter the area from the northeast, perform slow hovering motions above the desert floor, then accelerate away at impossible speeds, often changing direction mid-flight without slowing down. The footage confirmed it, and so did the notes his uncle had written. These were not single sightings, they were part of something structured, something that returned repeatedly like clockwork. Daniel used mapping software to plot each sighting, and discovered a repeating arc, a curved trajectory, that passed over 3 known military installations and ended directly above the Echo site BR-73. The orbs did not wander aimlessly, they were following a path, perhaps even a mission. Late one night, while reviewing reel for Daniel, noticed something he had missed before, a tiny flicker in the top corner of the frame that seemed to glitch every time the orb moved past it. It wasn't a camera error, it happened to precisely every single time, at the exact same position on the screen. He read it again and again, until he realized what it was. The power in the area was dipping slightly every time the object passed by. And it was caught in the footage, not as a light change but as a momentary loss of magnetic fidelity, a brief static pulse that could only be captured by analog film. This was not just strange behavior. This was measurable interference, something that affected the environment itself, something that could potentially be traced. He dug through the box again, and found a second logbook, smaller with fewer entries but more technical. His uncle had started documenting radiation levels and electromagnetic field readings around the observation site, and those readings spiked during each sighting. Consistent increases followed by rapid drops, always within minutes of each object appearing. Daniel could hardly believe what he was reading. These weren't just sightings, they were full-blown encounters, documented with scientific precision and hidden away for decades. He began to wonder if anyone else had seen the same things and been told to forget or stay silent. He returned to the forum, where he had first leaked the digitized footage, and began posting pieces of the logs, redacted entries, hints about coordinates and times, hoping someone out there might recognize the pattern or come forward with their own data. Within days, someone did. A user going by the name Sentinel41 posted a blurry photo of an almost identical orb taken in 1982, with a note claiming their father had been stationed at a base near Tonopah and had told stories of lights that moved like ghosts in the sky, silent, fast, and always gone before the jets could get close. Daniel messaged them privately, and what followed was a long late-night exchange of stories, memories, fragments of the same mystery echoing across different parts of the country. He was no longer alone in this. Whatever the orbs were, wherever they came from, they had been seen before, and now people were finally beginning to connect the dots. Daniel knew the footage was bigger than him, bigger than his uncle, bigger than any single base or incident. He had debated for days whether to release it, worried not just about his own safety but about whether anyone would believe it or care. But after hearing from Sentinel41 and 2 others who shared similar encounters, one from New Mexico and one from Alaska, he felt something shift, a quiet kind of urgency growing louder inside him, a voice that said, now is the time, people are ready, the world is watching, and maybe for once it will listen. He took precautions. He scrubbed the metadata from every file, renamed each one using random strings and timestamps. He uploaded the videos in segments across multiple hidden sites, deep in the encrypted corners of the internet where researchers and truth seekers gathered away from the noise of mainstream platforms. The first drop included the cleanest footage from Reel 3, showing a perfect shot of a glowing sphere moving silently past a radio tower before pulsing twice and vanishing in a bright flash. The video caught fire within hours, reposted, dissected, slowed down, and enhanced by amateur analysts and former military techs. A lightsome one stitched it into a timeline with other known sightings. Someone else traced the radio tower and matched it to an abandoned range outside Fallon, Nevada. Daniel watched in silence as the footage spread like wildfire, but he told no one, not his family, not his friends, not even the people he had been exchanging messages with online. He wanted the footage to stand on its own, without bias or interpretation, raw and unfiltered like the moment he first watched it flicker to life in his basement. But the internet is never quiet and never private. And within a week his uploads had been traced back to one of his temporary IP addresses, not directly but close enough to raise flags. 3 of the platforms hosting the files were taken down with vague explanations about violations of digital policy. To others simply vanished overnight, their domains erased. Their archives gone. It was subtle enough to avoid headlines but obvious enough for those paying attention to understand this was being silenced. Daniel received an email with no subject and no sender. It contained only a single sentence, "Stop while you can," followed by a link to a broken page. He ignored it, thinking it was a scare tactic, until he noticed an unfamiliar car parked across from his house 2 nights in a row. Dark windows, engine idling, no one stepping out. He told himself it was paranoia, just his mind running wild. But the next day his internet was cut off. Then his phone began dropping calls mid-sentence, and then came the moment that made his skin crawl. His front door had been unlocked when he returned home. Nothing missing, nothing moved, just open, as if someone had entered and left without touching a thing. A silent message that night. Daniel backed up every piece of footage, every scan of the logbook, every message and photograph onto multiple encrypted drives, and sent them to 3 people. He barely knew. One was Sentinel-41, the others were trusted users with reputations for releasing information. No matter the risk, he told them to wait for a signal, and only release it if he disappeared or went silent for more than a week. The truth had been set loose, and even if they tried to erase it, someone somewhere would see what Daniel had seen, and begin to question everything. The footage could no longer be ignored, not by skeptics, not by believers, and certainly not by the people who had spent decades making sure it stayed buried. Within days of the public drop, mainstream news outlets picked up pieces of it without context, calling it another wave of mysterious UFO videos. But this time the details were too sharp, the camera angles too structured, the presence of radio towers and visible military markers too specific to dismiss as coincidence. The footage was different. It felt authentic, and it sparked a frenzy of speculation across every corner of the internet. Within 72 hours, an official statement came from a defense spokesperson claiming the videos were digitally manipulated fabrications of low quality and not affiliated with any known military activity. But they offered no evidence, and when questioned during a live interview, the spokesperson became visibly uncomfortable, dodging technical questions and referring to unknown experts who could not be named for security reasons. This response only fueled the fire, drawing attention from several retired military analysts who began to speak publicly about their own strange experiences while stationed at remote bases during the same time period. What caught Daniel's attention most was not what the government said, but what it didn't say. Certain departments remained silent, completely absent from press releases and interviews, particularly those connected to electronic surveillance and aerospace development. No denial, no comment, just silence, and that silence spoke volumes to those who had been following the story closely. People like Sentinel-41 and others began piecing together timelines that showed how quickly the platforms hosting the original footage had been taken down, in some cases within minutes of the files being uploaded. Some users began sharing screenshots of suspicious activity on their devices, files disappearing, cloud accounts locked without warning. Others claimed their emails were being blocked or delayed. Any conversation involving the footage seemed to hit invisible walls. Daniel himself received a letter in the mail with no return address and no sender. Inside was a printout of a legal threat, citing violation of national security protocols and unauthorized possession of military property. There was no seal, no department listed, just a stark warning and a deadline to comply within 5 days or face undisclosed consequences. Despite the fear, despite the growing sense of being watched, Daniel refused to back down. He began working with a small group of independent journalists who had experience handling sensitive material, including leaked documents from past government scandals. One of them had already begun drafting an article connecting Project Echo 47 to a defunct Cold War monitoring program that had supposedly ended in 1985, yet records showed budget allocations for Echo-related technology well into the late 1990s. The journalists dug deeper. They uncovered procurement contracts, signed by shell companies that were tied to aerospace contractors, known for developing stealth technology and experimental propulsion systems. Everything was lining up to suggest that the sightings were not just real but actively studied and maybe even replicated behind closed doors. The government had moved into damage control, but their strategy was subtle, not full denial, not outright censorship, just enough doubt injected into the conversation to divide the public and distract the media. But Daniel knew once the seed of truth was planted, it could not be. Unplanted people were starting to pay attention, and some were beginning to remember stories they had once been told to forget. The air around Daniel began to change, not just figuratively but in a way that clung to him, like static, as if something unseen had settled into his life and refused to leave. He no longer felt alone in his own home. Each night brought strange sounds, faint clicks from phone lines, electrical hums that grew louder near. Certain walls, shadows that seemed out of place. When he checked the curtains at midnight once, he thought he saw a figure standing across the street, but when he looked again, it was gone. The car returned, the one with the dark tinted windows parked in different spots, never staying more than 20 minutes, but always facing his house, always with the engine off. Daniel began taking photos of it, each time logging the dates and times he knew better than to confront it. He had heard stories from whistleblowers about how pressure was applied, not directly, not violently, but through fear, through suggestion, through quiet steps that left no fingerprints, only uncertainty. Then came the voice messages. Each time his phone rang, there was only static or a low mechanical hum. Once a voice, barely above a whisper, said, "Do not speak again," and then silence. No number, no traceable signal, just a sudden heavy stillness that filled the room afterward like the echo of something watching. He changed his number, but the calls continued. Daniel knew then without question that someone was monitoring him, someone with the tools and authority to bypass civilian systems and make themselves invisible. He sent another package, this time to an old college contact who worked in cybersecurity. Inside was a flash drive with the full unedited film reels, every page of the logbooks, and a note that simply said, "If anything happens to me, release everything." He began sleeping with the light on, locking every door twice, and setting up motion detectors in the hallway. But it was not enough, because the danger was no longer just digital. It had come into the physical world. One evening, he returned from a grocery run and found his back door open, not forced, not broken, just unlocked. A chair had been moved slightly away from the kitchen table. A drawer left open just enough to notice his laptop was still there. So was the projector and the reels. But his backup drives were missing. Only the originals remained untouched. It was as if someone had entered, searched, verified, and left without making a sound, and Daniel understood. They were not there to steal, they were sending a message. He filed a police report out of routine but left out the parts he could not explain. They took notes, nodded, and gave him a card, but their eyes said they would not be following up. He was on his own and he knew it, so he doubled down, encrypting everything, switching devices, rotating storage, hiding backup drives in locations even he did not keep written down. Danger was no longer a concept, it was a presence, and Daniel could feel it breathing down his neck. Every time he stepped outside, he had become a threat, not because of what he believed, but because of what he could prove. And the truth he now carried was more than a secret, it was a target. Daniel had reached the point where nothing surprised him anymore, or so he thought until the message arrived. It was buried in an encrypted forum thread titled Operation Grey Echo, and posted by a new user with no history, no avatar, and no signature. The message was simple: "I was there. Echo 47 is real. You are not alone." It included a download link, protected by multiple layers of passwords which were revealed through a riddle hidden in the user's follow-up comment. Daniel solved it in less than an hour, driven not by curiosity but by something heavier, a sense that this was not another lead but something final, something undeniably. File opened to reveal a scanned government memo, dated July 23, 1982, classified, top secret, eyes only, and signed by a high-level officer in the Department of Defense. The subject line read, UAP Surveillance Protocol, Echo 47 BR-73, and the contents made Daniel's heart race. It described a series of unauthorized aerial intrusions over restricted test sites across Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, matching the dates in his uncle's logbook and even referencing specific events captured in the footage. he had released, but what struck Daniel most was the language. The memo did not speculate, it did not question, it referred to the phenomena, with certainty, calling the objects craft of unknown origin, with advanced flight capabilities beyond the scope of current terrestrial technology. It mentioned recovery efforts, failed interceptions, and instances of temporary communication blackouts around the base perimeter during sightings. It confirmed electromagnetic anomalies exactly as Daniel and his uncle had documented. The final paragraph of the memo chilled him the most. It stated that all personnel involved in Echo 47 would be subject to lifetime non-disclosure agreements, and any breach would be prosecuted under federal espionage laws. It closed with the directive that all analog evidence was to be collected, reviewed, and permanently destroyed. To maintain national security and public stability, Daniel now had proof not just of the events, but of the cover-up and the deliberate erasure of the program's existence. He posted a heavily redacted version of the memo through a trusted journalist contact who published it within days, alongside a detailed article connecting Echo 47 to other known incidents, including the 1976 Tehran UFO encounter and the 1980 Rendlesham Forest event. The public reaction was immediate. The article was shared millions of times within a week, picked up by major networks, debated on podcasts, analyzed in video, essays by military veterans and physicists. Alike, the conversation had changed. This was no longer about blurry footage. It was about documented evidence of official knowledge. As the pressure built, Daniel received one final message from the anonymous source, a simple statement: "I am leaving the country. They know I talked. Do not try to contact me again." And with that, the account was deleted, wiped clean. As if it never existed, Daniel stared at the screen for a long time, realizing he might have just witnessed someone sacrificing their safety to push the truth one step closer to the light. The pieces were no longer scattered, they were forming a picture, and the image was clearer than ever. The government knew and had known for decades, and the only reason the world had not known too was because people like Daniel's uncle had been forced into silence, or worse. Daniel no longer cared about fear. He no longer cared about the warnings or the shadows or the black cars that still came and went without a word. He had reached the point where truth outweighed self-preservation, where silence became a betrayal, not just to his uncle but to everyone who had seen the impossible and been told to forget it. He spent his days cataloging every reel, scanning every note, organizing every conversation into timelines and case files. He had become an archivist of the unknown, a historian of what was never supposed to be remembered. The footage was now archived across multiple countries, hosted on decentralized servers, protected by activists and researchers who believed that some information belonged to the people, not the institutions that sought to bury it. It had been translated into 6 languages, cited in 3 academic papers, and dissected by aerospace engineers who admitted on record that they could not replicate the physics behind the objects' movements. Members of Congress had even requested classified briefings related to Echo 47, prompting a storm of closed-door meetings and redacted responses that only raised more questions. Daniel had not appeared in public. He refused every interview, every media offer, every book deal. He knew that becoming a face would only make him a target. He remained a ghost in the system, guiding the movement from the background, ensuring that the truth could never be locked away again. His last act before disappearing from all known accounts was to release the full digital archive, a master file named Project Echo 47 Untouched, containing every document, every frame, and every transcript. The release changed everything. It became the foundation for independent investigations launched by journalists, scientists, and even a few ex-military officials who had grown tired of the silence. It sparked forums, lectures, public panels, new laws demanding transparency around unidentified aerial activity. The stigma was breaking slowly, painfully but undeniably, and the public had begun to ask questions they were never supposed to ask: questions about technology, about threats, about the boundaries of human knowledge. Daniel watched all of this unfold from a distance, never stepping forward, never claiming credit. It was never about him. It was about the work, the truth, and the people who had come before him, the ones who had witnessed the same lights in the sky and been forced to carry that knowledge alone. His uncle had kept the reels because he believed someday someone would understand, and Daniel had become that someone, not by choice but by duty. In time, the phrase Echo 47 would become shorthand for one of the most significant data leaks in modern history, a symbol of quiet resistance and hidden knowledge revealed. And though Daniel would remain a mystery to the public, those within the movement knew his name and knew what he had risked to bring the truth into the light. The footage remained untouched, raw, unedited, as it had always been a relic of a time when the world thought it was alone, and a reminder that the sky above was never empty and the silence below had never been honest.